And I think the reality is, I think many of us see the injustice in this world, the inequities in this world, and ask ourselves, what do we do? What do people of faith do? What do people of goodwill do? And I think a real key component is we can't know where we need to go until we kind of know how we got here. The way in which our present has been so profoundly shaped by six systems of racist systems of oppression that we inherited, that our ancestors created. So we really can't like go forward until we look back and kind of see how we got here. Kind of acknowledge the past, acknowledge kind of what brought us here. In many ways, see how these systems of injustice and oppression in some ways work in favor of those who have power and privilege. We got this power and privilege by, in many ways, denying it from others and kind of hoarding that. So we can't really move forward until we take this kind of really honest look at the past and kind of see what brought us here. I was reminded of this story that Kierkegaard tells in one of his books. Kierkegaard tells a story where, this woman is standing at a crossroads. This peasant woman is standing at a crossroad, and this man comes storming out of an inn and says to her at the crossroads, "Is this the road to London?" And she goes, "Yes." And the guy goes off down the road. And then she says, "He never asked which direction London was in." Like, you can't know where you're going until you kind of know how you got there, or you can head off in a completely wrong direction.
So it sounds like what you're saying is we're going to have to have an honest and sober reckoning with our past. What period in our history do you think would most help us understand how we got where we are now?
I think we need to acknowledge the fact that these systems of systemic racism in our church and in our world are present today and have been present ever since the inception of whatever the predecessor of the United States was. I mean, folks were English colonies had only been here 12 years before they started importing Africans. 1619 was when the first Africans were transported here against their will. So this is hard baked into our entire understanding, into aspects of who we are as Americans. So while there are certain time periods and certain eras that I like to focus on, I think we need to acknowledge aspects of this have been present ever since. It's kind of built into the who we are as an American experiment, this aspect of systemic racism and injustice and oppression. One that I like to focus on in some of the teaching that I do, and I focused on particularly in the blog, and the most recent blog post that I put out there, is this 1870 to 1930, 1940 period. And one of the reasons I focused on this in the blog post, and I focused on this in a lot of my teaching, is frankly, it's an era that a lot of us like to skip over in the church. When I teach my church history classes, I like to say, most Episcopalians like to skip from Absalom Jones to the Civil Rights Movement because we only want to tell the good parts. We want to tell ourselves, yeah, we were the first American denomination to ordain an African American. That's true. The Episcopal Church was the first historically white denomination to ordain an African American. And the Episcopal Church was actively engaged in the Civil Rights Movement. We tend to kind of leave out, the 160 years or so in the middle when all these racist systems of systemic oppression were created, and the way the church was complicit in that, and a particular way in which this 1870 to 1930, 1940 period is really fundamental and essential to kind of the creation of the systemic systems of racist oppression in American society and in the churches as well, and particularly in the Episcopal Church. And I think a key aspect of that is the way in which we see how, there's no really good way to put it, a lot of American Protestant Christianity, and particularly the Episcopal Church, simply abandoned African Americans after the Civil War and after emancipation. And a number of dioceses in the Episcopal Church enslaved Africans comprised a significant number of members. About half the membership of the Diocese of South Carolina in 1861 was enslaved Africans. Now, we can rightly ask, did these folks have any choice in the matter? Most of these folks were baptized Episcopalians because the persons who owned them at that time were Episcopalians, and that was the chapel that was on the plantation. We can rightly ask how many of that 50%. But what we do know is in the 1870s, a lot of African-American, newly freed African-Americans wanted to remain Episcopalians. They formed their own congregations. We know of almost half a dozen in South Carolina alone. African-Americans got together, formed their own congregations. And when I talk about the abandonment of African-American Episcopalians after the Civil War, it's kind of a twofold abandonment. It was on a very visceral level, in that many of the Southern dioceses simply refused to recognize or ordain leadership for these African-American congregations. We have a specific situation in South Carolina. There were 6 congregations formed in the 1870s by freed African-Americans. They asked for clergy to be ordained for them. The bishop refused, and it's all in writing. We know exactly why he refused. He said, these folks are barely removed from savagery and barbarism and have absolutely no ability to be any kind of leaders. I said, absolutely won't ordain any folks for these congregations, because I'll ordain white folks for these Black congregations, but I'll never ordain Black clergy for these congregations. And in turn, these 6 congregations turned to the Reformed Episcopal Church, which was a schism created in 1873 over something completely different. And they came right in and said, yeah, absolutely, we'll ordain clergy for you. And a bishop. Reformed Episcopal Church even ordained a bishop for these African-American congregations. So we know that from 1866 to 1886, only 20 African-Americans were ordained in the entire Episcopal Church, North and South. North and South. So we see just an unwillingness to provide leadership, ordained leadership for these congregations that were forming in the South, to the extent that many African-American Episcopalians simply left and became Methodists, Baptists, all sorts of other, where in the South, many historic additional African-American denominations were formed in the wake of the Civil War. So on the one level, we have on a kind of granular level, we had African-Americans coming to the church and asking for acceptance and being told no. But we also see this on a more structural level. And so moving from kind of congregational level, beginning in the 1880s, in 1883, all the Southern bishops, all the bishops of the former Confederacy, meet at the University of the South in Sewanee in 1883, and essentially put forward a number of different proposals to have legislated segregation in the Episcopal Church. There were varying ways. One of these would have been to create a kind of non-geographic African-American jurisdiction. This is what other denominations did, so that essentially all the Black congregations were put in a single entity. If you had a congregation in Colorado and a congregation in Massachusetts, they'd be in the same diocese. So to create kind of a national, this is what the Methodist Church eventually did. What became the United Methodist Church eventually created a national entity in which they put all their African-American congregations. Some kind of spun off and created new denominations, but Presbyterian Church did. They essentially created historically African-American Presbyterian denominations. So they were kicking these two things around. And what the Southern bishops decided to propose is to have, and this is important, kind of canonically defined segregated structures within the diocese. That within each diocese, they decided to try and do it on a diocesan level. That in each diocese, there would essentially be, I don't know if y'all have deaneries in Colorado, we get deaneries here. You'd put all the Black congregations in one deanery, but the white congregations would remain in their geographic deaneries. So whether you were in Grand Junction or whether you were in, Denver, you'd be in the same deanery. So that's what they decided to propose in 1883, was to canonically define this and allow this and permit this. And between 1883 and 1940, this proposal was put forward at every single General Convention. Some version of this proposal to create canonically defined segregation in the church is put forward at every single General Convention. And everyone knew exactly what was going on at the time. I mentioned this in my blog post. George Freeman Bragg, who was the great historian of African American Episcopal church history at this time. He was born in slavery in 1863 and died in 1940. Lived, his whole life kind of spans the very period I'm talking about, this kind of 1870, 1930 period. He's a priest for 51 years. He writes about it. He says, yeah, the white bishops met in Sewanee in 1883. No Negroes, to use his language, were invited. And they were trying to create segregation within each diocese. He could have named it what it was. He could have wrote, yeah, all the Southern bishops met in 1883 to come up with a segregation plan. So on the kind of granular level, kind of unwillingness to provide the kind of leadership and to foster any kind of congregational life for African-American Episcopalians, and repeated efforts, for over 50 years at the national level, repeated efforts to try and create some kind of canonically defined, kind of segregated structure for the Episcopal Church. So we see that there's two ways, on a local level, and then efforts on to create a kind of essentially segregated church. I think one thing to also keep in mind, while we focus in some ways on what was happening in the South, we shouldn't in any way, shape, or form think things were largely any better in the North. Northern dioceses were segregated. Most African Americans were not admitted to seminaries like General Theological Seminary in New York, or most Northern seminaries would not admit African American students. While some of what I focus on here is what was happening in the South. Most Northern cities had a historically African American congregation, and it would have been unthinkable to have if any African American members showed up in Buffalo, they would have been sent immediately to St. Philip's Church, which was the historically African American church in Buffalo. So we shouldn't in any way, shape, or form think, while these things play themselves out in different ways, that the Northern dioceses weren't just as racist and just as segregated, kind of in their own way.
So when did it begin to shift, such that there was at least some effort on diocesan bishops' part to incorporate into their own diocesan structure Black congregations? I know you mentioned, as we were in my preparation for you, mentioned about South Carolina in 1928. I think you said they appointed a suffragan bishop at that point.
I think, sure. I think the suffragan bishop and the development of the very office of suffragan bishop, I think, is a really powerful example when we want to talk about systemic racism. Well, by definition, systemic racism is built into, it means there are things inherent in the system itself that are racist. The fact that in our current context, African Americans are 15 times more likely to be sentenced to death for, killing a white person as a white person is for killing an African American person. We can look at those kinds of examples of systemic racism. In some ways, the suffragan bishop, the office of suffragan bishop itself, is an example of this kind of systemic racism. Essentially, the Southern bishops realized we're not going to get it. We're not going to get the kind of defined by canon. They wanted a canon that would say every bishop can set up African American jurisdictions in their diocese. They wanted that in the constitutions and canons of the Episcopal Church. They eventually realized they ain't going to get it. It's just not going to, there's enough opposition, thankfully, there's enough opposition in the church. So they realize they're not going to get it. So, like racists always do, they try and come up with some workarounds. Provinces were kind of thought out by the Southern Church as a way to essentially get a church within a church. Like we have our kind of, provinces in the church, 9 provinces in the church, or 8 continental, 9 extra. was originally thought up in the 1880s and 1890s by the Southern Diocese to get a church within a church. One of the wildest proposals they came up with is they proposed a proposal for provinces right around 1901, I want to say, in that divided the church into provinces. Conveniently, most of the Southern Dioceses were in their own province. And their proposal was the General Convention would only meet once every 10 years and would only focus on the prayer book and the Constitution. And that provinces would elect their own bishops, consecrate their own bishops, and be able to write their own canons. It was just an absolutely blatant effort to essentially resurrect the Confederate Church by another mechanism, to kind of have their own church within a church. Again, didn't pass. But where they finally got some traction was around the proposals for suffragan bishops. We're starting to build in the 1880s and the 1890s, suffragan bishop in the sense of, electing assisting bishop. The only thing we had in the church were diocesan bishops up to that point. And coadjutor, the coadjutor, the bishop who succeeds the diocese. That was the only category. So Northern dioceses keep putting forward these proposals for a suffragan bishop, assisting bishop in a diocese, so one that is elected by the diocese. This is the key with a suffragan, has no jurisdiction in and of himself at that time, but only as designated it by the diocesan. Some suffragans are given geographic oversight, some are, so anyway, but the key is the suffragan bishop is elected by the diocese, but there's still only one bishop. There's still only the diocesan bishop, and the diocesan bishop kind of determines the duties and responsibilities of a suffragan. Southern dioceses weren't cool about this. They didn't want suffragan bishops. They thought this would give more votes to the Northern diocese in the House of Bishops. When we had a lot of rapidly growing, urbanizing, Chicago had 30,000 people in 1840 and had 1 million people in 1900. So we're looking at rapidly growing, urbanizing Northern dioceses. The Southern dioceses were not keen on the suffragan bishop bit, and it doesn't get very far. Then essentially, the Southern dioceses make a deal with the Northern diocese. They say, you know what? We'll go with you on the suffragan bishop stuff, but we insist that suffragan bishops have no voice or vote in the House of Bishops. Because the Southern diocese intended to use this to elect African Americans to minister to African Americans, to essentially get that church within a church. So essentially, and this is where we also see the complicity. We think in some ways, the ways in which Malcolm X used to talk about, the Southern wolf and the Northern fox, when he talked about racism. That it's just as racist, but it expresses itself in different kinds of ways. There's an overtness, as Malcolm X talks about with the Southern wolf and Northern fox. But in the end, someone's getting hunted one way or the other, whether it's a wolf or a fox. So the Southern dioceses were pretty clear. They were willing to support the Northern diocese on the suffragan bishop canon, and they insisted no voice or vote because they intended to elect African Americans. They had absolutely no intention of letting these African American bishops sit in the House of Bishops. And so essentially they agree. And so the suffragan bishop canon passes, and some Northern dioceses start proposing and electing suffragan bishops. But in the South, 2 African Americans are elected suffragan bishop, and their dioceses create convocations. They create the term of the time, colored convocations. And the bishops in those dioceses essentially are the bishops for those colored convocations, and increasingly begin to minister to other African American congregations nearby in neighboring dioceses and local dioceses. So essentially you have Black bishops or Black congregations. They couldn't get legislated segregation, but what we get is kind of de facto, where Southern dioceses create convocations. Then we have African American bishops who minister largely to African American congregations and have no voice or vote in the House of Bishops. This also is yet another example of this kind of systemic racism within the church. We talk about Absalom Jones, who was ordained a deacon in 1795 and a priest in 1804. and was priest of first African-American ordained by a white congregation in the United States. But again, the deal that they made was Absalom Jones was ordained priest. He was rector of St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, but he had no voice or vote in convention, and St. Thomas Church had no voice or vote in the diocesan convention. That was the deal. William White, who was Bishop of Pennsylvania, said, "We'll ordain you priest on the condition you have no voice or vote in convention. Your congregation have no voice or vote in convention." And it wasn't until 1860 that St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in Pennsylvania had representation. So the church had done this before, to deny representation in voice and vote. So these two guys consecrated suffragan bishop and served dutifully and faithfully, ministering to African American congregations. And this is where we see, one of the most, what we're seeing, what we saw on the streets this summer, what we have seen time and time again, what we have seen is that white supremacy has to be enforced by violence and murder to be most effective. Often state-sponsored violence and murder. And so these two African Americans are consecrated bishop. And then the Bishop of South Carolina, which has one of the largest numbers of African American congregations, calls for the election of a third African American suffragan, and he's murdered in his office. White supremacist breaks into his office, guns him down, and murders him in his office. And no African American is ever elected again as suffragan bishop under this canon, and none is even proposed. There's no other calls for the election of an African American suffragan after this point. And that essentially kind of closes the door in that chapter. That's in 1928 when the Bishop of South Carolina is murdered. It kind of closes the door in that chapter of this history. And then in the 30s and the 40s, we're beginning to move towards kind of the very beginnings and inklings of what will kind of blossom into civil rights movement in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. So that puts a terrifying and chilling kind of coda to that kind of 1870, 1930 experience of African Americans, kind of the nadir, the low point of that aspect.
So we in the Episcopal Church like to talk about our record during the civil rights movement, and we kind of lean on that. So can you give us some insight into what really happened then, and also during our conversation? I don't want to miss what you have to say. What you have to say about the way the Episcopal Church treated slavery before the Civil War. I want you to get to that at some point too. But tell us about the
Episcopal Church rightly has a lot to be proud of when it comes to civil rights. We begin to see real efforts, broad coalitions of folks across the church. Civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s is one of the broadest social justice movements that religious organizations have been a part of. Roman Catholics, Jews, Unitarian Universalists, mainline Protestants, it is one of the broadest social justice coalitions ever built in American history. The March on Washington in 1963, where Dr. King gave his speech, was co-sponsored by the National Council of Churches, along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the other civil rights entities that were part of that. The National Council of Churches is one of the main organizers of the March on Washington in August 1963. The Episcopal Church moved its General Convention from Houston, Texas to Honolulu, Hawaii, because in 1958, because the convention organizer said we can't serve an integrated banquet. You would have to have segregated meals. And the Episcopal Church refused and moved their convention. A number of organizations, the Episcopal Society, so a number of civil rights organizations were created within the church. So the church has a lot was very actively engaged and involved. But where we see a challenge, and this is where I think there could be some fruitful conversation around bringing it to some of our current context around issues around reparations for slavery, issues around restorative justice, issues around police reforming, issues around any number of things we're kind of asking right now. I hear a lot of this going on right now. What do we actually do? Whereas in the civil rights movement, I think there's a lot that the Episcopal Church has to be proud of, and where the Episcopal Church was actively engaged in the social justice works. But where the Episcopal Church did a really terrible job in the 1960s was around these issues of restorative justice. Really not so good, not so good. Real quick, because I know we're kind of getting to the halfway mark here. 1967 General Convention, the presiding bishop at the time, John Hines, stop me if any of this sounds familiar, says it's time for the Episcopal Church to finally do something about racial justice. We're a church that has been extraordinarily privileged, we're a church that has a lot of resources. Is this church ever going to stand up and do some actual things to back up all the things? And literally saying this in 1967, you know, the cities are burning. The riots that gripped cities in 1967. And the Episcopal Church says yes. And budgets the equivalent now of about $25 million to community empowerment programs. Says we are going to take all this money that we have and use it to finally do something, do some kind of restorative justice stuff. And it flops miserably. It is just kind of catastrophically flops for two reasons. One is they just wrote a bunch of checks. They didn't build relationships. They said, okay, if you want some money for community empowerment, we're writing checks. So they started kind of handing out money. That was one problem. And the second was they didn't consult with Hispanic, Latino, Native American, African American, Asian American Episcopalians who said, we've been here all along. Why didn't you come to us to ask us to be a part of this? To the point where it got so bad, for only the second time in the history of the Episcopal Church, we called a special General Convention. You know, we have one every 3 years, but there's a mechanism to call. So in 1969, they called a special General Convention to deal with the fallout of this program that was created. The deputies of color in the House, you know, in the House of Deputies occupied the podium in the House of Deputies and demanded a conversation about systemic racism and reparations. And said, well, and General Convention refused to have it, and they walked out. There was a massive walkout of deputies of color from the 1969 General Convention. So I think a really chilling aspect, well, we talk about that aspect of the civil rights movement. You know, folks want to talk about the fact that Thurgood Marshall was an Episcopalian and was a deputy to General Convention, and the Episcopal Church was actively involved in the civil rights movement. I think a really chilling aspect of what happened to the 1960s is how we completely flubbed our first effort at any kind of systemic restorative justice aspect to it. And that's really something that I think is something to keep coming back to, as I think we're coming to a moment in the church where I feel this is kind of happening again. I think we're seeing some movement towards having broader conversations about restorative justice in the life of the church. So that's something that should terrify us about the civil rights movement, is how utterly and completely we flubbed the first effort at restorative justice and the presiding bishop ended up resigning before his term was done because it all kind of fell apart. Dioceses started withholding their assessments, and they laid off a bunch of staff. And one of the important things to come out of that is one of the things that came out of the debacle of the Special General Convention in 1969 was they created staff positions for Hispanic, Latino, African American, Native American, Asian American staff positions to make sure that that voice would never, but always kind of be at the table, that we wouldn't make that mistake again of not having folks at the table who needed to be at the table. It's one tangible thing that came out of that.
So that we don't make those mistakes again, what would you say to us as we move forward? How can we be better followers of Jesus and better neighbors and community members and community builders? What do we need to actually do?
Really? This is the point where, you know, my wife would say, I would say, well, what do you think we need to do? What do you think we need to do? I think, I'm a historian looking at the past. What we do is, it's not just about money, it's about relationship. These are the two things we can learn from the debacle of the General Convention program of 1967. It's not about money, it's as much, even more so about relationships than it is about money. So how do we continue to build, be in conversation, be in relationship, be in partnership? It's about relationship building with the kind of stakeholders. I think the church has to have a healthy sense of humility that if we could have solved racism now, we would have solved it already. If we wanted to, we couldn't do it on our own. We would need the collaboration and cooperation with lots of community-based organizations, not just religious. This is where we need a similar kind of coalition like the Civil Rights Movement, which was a coalition of secular, community-based, and religious-based. I think we need a similar kind of broader coalition. Faith communities are a part of this, but can't do it on our own. Kind of like with climate change stuff. We're not going to solve issues around climate change, faith communities on our own. We need to work with legislators. We need to work with science community. We need to build a similar kind of broader coalition. So I think the way we kind of take some steps is realize we need to build a kind of broader coalition. But I also think those with power and privilege and authority need to be willing to let some of that go. And I think the church needs to, this is where I think the church in particular has to ask some really hard questions. Those who have benefited from these systemic structures of racism, which if we look at our past and we do this kind of historical reflection, we kind of can see that and acknowledge that. What do we then need to do? Those who have benefited by it need to ask real hard. We're seeing some of that. University of the South, Virginia Theological Seminary have both set aside significant parts of their endowments to start having broader conversations about how they essentially make amends for this, if not reparations, and the kind of setting aside this money. So we've seen two of our seminaries have acknowledged they had benefited kind of from the slave system. I think I'm a resident in the Diocese of Massachusetts. We put forward a resolution that's going before our convention that kind of does this twofold thing. It says we're going to create resources so that every entity in the Diocese of Massachusetts, parishes, diocesan ministries, we've been here since, we've been here for a while. We got a lot of entities. Needs to go look into its past and see how it might have benefited from these structures of systemic racism and slavery. And this is where I think slavery is important. There are lots of historians who say the slave system was 20 to 25% of the US economy before the Civil War. Not just the whole issue around farming in the South, but also these were the textiles that were fueling the industrial boom in the North. A lot of these folks in the North, they're the ones that were putting out life insurance policies and letting people take out mortgages on their slave, the way it was enmeshed in the financial system. So lots of folks benefited. The slave economy was an enormous, but also the way in which these issues of systemic racism also benefited. My dad served in World War II. He came home and got a VA loan and went to any college that he wanted. And African-American vets who came home from the same war couldn't get the loans because they were redlined and couldn't go to any college they wanted. The fact that the way in which these systemic systems of racism also benefited some people and not others who are still alive today. This is where it's not just a historical question. It's systemic. This is where Ta-Nehisi Coates has done a tremendous amount of work. The systemic issues of racism are still active today and are still creating this kind of discourse. So we've got to ask a lot of questions about how do we benefit from this? How did some aspects of our church benefit from this? Now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? I think we can let that overwhelm us sometimes. One of the things I like to talk about is we also need to realize there's some real simple, practical, tangible things we could do. I was talking with a clergy colleague of mine here in Massachusetts, and she said to me, I walk through my church and there's a plaque on the wall for the guy who founded the church and gave the money for it. And it says he was the first settler of this area. And she's like, he wasn't the first settler of this area. There were Native Americans here for thousands of years. And she's like, so I just changed it to the first white settler of this area. That's just something real simple. It doesn't cost nothing, you know, but it begins to tell the story. So she just changed that to the first white settler in this area who gave the foundation. So let's not lose sight of the fact that, well, we can get twisted into knots around some of the broader aspects of restorative justice. There's a lot simpler things we can do. I think another thing is, how do we let these issues help shape the decisions we know we have to make? I'll say one thing here, and that's probably getting towards discussion time. One of the things I love is with the Diocese of Rhode Island, just south of us to here. They were going to close their cathedral downtown. Downtown had changed, you know, changing patterns of, they just, you know, they were going to have to close this church in the downtown. And so what they did was, instead of selling it, they kind of folded it into this conversation. Well, we're having this conversation about systemic racism in Rhode Island and in the diocese, and we need to figure out what to do with this church. What if we kind of did these two things together? So they created a Center for Reconciliation. Instead of just selling that building, they turned it into a history of African-American community in Rhode Island, and specifically around how Rhode Island benefited from the slave trade and from how churches. So they created a kind of museum, teaching center, Center of Reconciliation, in a building that they had to figure out what to do with anyways. So as we're thinking about other things, how do we let this conversation kind of mesh up with some of the other decisions we're making as well about some of the things we do? And that's a two-step process we're trying to do here in Massachusetts. Look at the past, and then begin to ask some real hard questions. When we determine who's benefited from this, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?
Your story a moment ago about the rector, the lady who was the rector of the church, and she changed it to the first white settler. I imagine that there was some pushback to that, and I wonder if you could talk to us about the phenomenon that we see of that kind of pushback, and the visceral emotional reactions that some of us have in the church.
Sure, and I'd also be open to other folks' wisdom here. I'm a historian, so I approach this a different way. I'm like, well, that's true. He was the first white. Like, what's the big deal? He was the first white settler. As a historian, I'm like, what's the big deal? It's actually factually true. So I come from this from a different perspective. But I think if we approach this with anxiety, I think folks will pick up on that anxiety and be super anxious. I think what we need to do is just simply say this, if something's in the closet, whether you open the closet or not, so you may as well open the closet. It's not going to go away. It's not going to get any better. The only way, I think, to address some of this kind of, I see that the anxiety I can see when some of these things come up, I think the only way to address it is to explore it more in depth. Because if you ignore it, the anxiety is not going to go away. It's actually going to get worse. So I think that, somebody's got to open the closet and acknowledge what's in there. So I think actually, while there's certainly kind of there can be an initial level of anxiety, I think addressing it and acknowledging it while it's difficult is really the only way to move forward. Also, I freely acknowledge there are racist folks in the world, and some racist folks in the world aren't interested in this. There are some racist folks who even deny the very existence of systemic racism. And I think we need to acknowledge that and certainly say in some ways, we're not trying to say that we can't in any way make any kind of peace or continue the kind of complicity that the church had with these structures of systemic racism. So I am unwilling and am not interested in being complicit with anyone's kind of racism at this point. I'd much rather have conversations with anxious folks than I am with racist folks, because you can get somewhere, you can get further.
Ha- have you, in your experience, as you've introduced these conversations and taken um, a good fair look at our history, have you had folks say they can't do it and they're leaving the church?
No, I think the most common thing I get is, "You just make me feel bad," is what most people say. No, I have
Oh,
not.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
and I'll be honest, because frankly, I don't think those people are coming to this conversation or coming to the talks I give.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the racist folks, I don't think are coming. I'd say the most common reaction I get is, "You're making me feel bad." And part of me is like, "Sunshine, I ain't worried about making you feel bad."
Right, right,
That's the
right.
least of my problems right now. People are, you know, when you think of, 5,000 people lynched between 1870 and 1930, I'm not worried about upsetting white people in 2020. So yes, while that anxiety is real, that's way down on my list of concerns. Now, I don't think you can be cruel or cavalier or mean about that, but I don't think you can give it any more power than you can let it give.
Right. So,
I mean, if you feed the bears, they come back. Don't feed the bears. Don't feed the bears. Don't feed that
so
anxiety.
right. So I mean, I'm a preacher. I've been outspoken about some of these things, and tried to, hopefully lead us into more conversations. But it's tough for people. And I'm not saying that we should baby anybody, but it is difficult for people to hear this kind of thing. And I've heard the same thing you just mentioned. Oh, it makes us feel bad. And my initial response is, I don't feel like that in terms of looking at history, somebody needs to hold our hands. We're grown-ups. We can look at this. So I'm like you. Is there a pastoral response to this where we don't make people feel bad, or is it just reality?
I think the pastoral response acknowledging, yeah, it is. It is. It's part of me is like, if it's not making you depressed, I think that's a good sign. It means you can still. It means you have a kind of a moral compass enough to be depressed by this. Yeah, no, I don't want in any way, shape, or form. This is really. I mean, I think I mentioned this in one of my blog posts. It just gets so spiritually draining reading page after page after page of this racist stuff. I mean, it just kind of sucks the life out of you. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't. This is hard, right? And while I don't, it is hard. It is difficult. It should depress and shock us. But I think that in turn can be a spark that kind of points us. Well, if you don't want to feel that way, let's do something about it. Like where does that try and move us to a different kind of place?
So you had mentioned a minute ago that you thought it would be coalitions of secular organizations and church organizations that would finally move our society into something that looked more like a loving, neighborly a community. Are there any existing organizations that you know of that are doing this well that the Episcopal Church could say, okay, we want to help you?
I think of some of the efforts towards, this is where I think there's some fruitful collaborations with, this is where the church is learning and has a lot to learn from community-based asset mapping stuff. The seminary where I was academic dean, we basically realized every time so many folks, so I think there's ways in which the church needs to learn from all the kinds of organizations that are working around voting rights, that are working around police reform, all these kind of community asset-based organizations where do you go look and see the networks and coalitions and strength that you kind of already have in place and get kind of all the folks together. Some of the anti-gang stuff. My wife was a priest at All Saints Episcopal Church in LA for a while, and the way in which religious organizations were working with community-based organizations in anti-gang efforts and anti-gang initiatives, and doing some really powerful and important stuff there. That was kind of a tangible way in which some of the anti-gang community-based organizations realized the churches had broad networks in the community, and they could leverage that. Like, you've got all these networks in the community. We can bring some of these opportunities we have to get folks out of kind of the gang system, and you in turn can help us make the kind of community-based contacts we have. Kind of example of that, kind of coming together and realizing in some ways we could bring different kind of strengths to these things.
So you mentioned in your blog post, what I read was one of the reasons why, going back to history, one of the reasons why we didn't make a stance on slavery is because the church was scared of schism. And that's sort of been an MO of ours. We don't want to get involved in that. We don't want to get in politics. It might divide our church or divide our congregations. So do you see that same dynamic at work now as everything, as Black Lives Matter is continuing to force its way to the surface, and even LGBTQ, right? Tell us about how the threat of schism is keeping us from doing the good work we need to do.
No, I think we see some of the, I think we've all, like a lot of us have seen those same kind of dynamics in place, fear around division in the church because of taking a stand. This is where, the fact that the Episcopal Church of most of the Protestant denominations of its time didn't split over slavery because it refused to take a stand.
Right.
Right. It's nothing to be. It's nothing to be proud of. These other churches split because they took stands around this. So yes, of course I see it. Yes, I think we see that in lots of different ways, in lots of different contexts. Concern around creating conflict in the church, and that's real, and it's certainly not something to be taken lightly. But there comes a time. On the one hand, you have to take a side. There comes a time when you got to take a side, and I think on the one hand, where you need to take a side, and I mentioned this in my blog post as well. The issues that we've talked about here with some of the questions around African American systemic racism with regards to African Americans are not confined to that at all, and we've done it again and again and again and again. The same issues around systemic racism with Native Americans in this church, with Hispanic Latino, Asian Americans, complicity with the way this church was complicit with issues around internment of Japanese Americans, which plenty of people at the time said was wrong. It was not as if no one knew that putting people American citizens in concentration camps wasn't a bad thing. Plenty of people said it at the time. And the church, by and large, not entirely, but by and large. So we've done it again and again and again and again. The way in which, and I mentioned this in my blog post as well, unity at the expense of someone is not unity, it's oppression. It's unity for the privileged and the powerful, and it's just normalizing oppression. That's not unity. It's only unity for the powerful and the privileged.
So one of our listeners asked a question. I've heard this on several occasions. Should we be doing work inside the church or directly for organizations that already exist?
Both.
What do you think?
I mean, I'm far from an expert on this, but I mean, my short answer is both. We need to do our own work. We need to do this. We need to tell this broader national story. This plays itself out in very, very different kinds of contexts. I think we need to kind of acknowledge that in some. I mean, the ways in which this is a national conversation, but in lots of ways, it's a lot of different local conversations. Where I am right now, one of the largest Native American reservations in the state is only a couple miles from my house. So our issue here is around issues around justice and equity, Native Americans. So then that's kind of how it's playing itself out here. So we have to do both. We have to do this work within the church, but also I think we need to do it outside of the church as well. We need to do both. And doing one makes you better, I think, at the other.
Right. Coalitions.
right? But if we can know who we are and how we got here, that makes us a more kind of authentic partner with colleagues and with other allies in this.
So one of our listeners has a question about mission and how different directions for mission can split churches. How does a church maintain its commitment to mission, even though it might be uncomfortable within its own walls? What's your guidance there for those churches?
I guess I would say I think if you're doing it right, there's not a conflict. I think this is where I think it gets back to the dynamic you and I are just chatting about. If you have to say we're not going to be just so we can continue our mission, is that really a mission worth having? In some ways, realize this can look a lot, but I mean, it kind of gets back to the issue around not splitting over slavery. I mean, I think if these questions around addressing significant, important, hard issues are impeding our mission, then maybe it's our mission we need to look at, and not the way in which these issues are causing conflict. Realizing we need to bring people on board, we need to realize people are in different places around this. My wife keeps telling me all the time, it's like, you've been studying this stuff for 20 years, create some room for people. And realizing we need to bring people on board, we need to be patient and gracious and create space, acknowledging all of that. But we also need to be wary about this dichotomy between preserving the status quo as opposed to taking a stand.
I asked that question. I was really interested in your answer, but I've noticed that same dynamic in our church. It's really hard for people to recognize that our missional work is not for the people who are inside our churches. That famous quote by William Temple, it's the only place that exists for people outside it. And then there's a tension between, but the church exists for us too, right? And so that's a really hard thing for people to sort of draw together. Anyway, I'm sure you struggle with that probably, or other clergy who have struggled with it, as well as congregants. Tom, it's really been nice to have you. Thank you.
It really has been an honor. I really, really appreciate the opportunity.
I'm gonna let our producer's gonna pull together some thoughts. I can tell she's thinking. I'm gonna give everybody.
There was one more question that got asked that I really want to have answered, and I'm gonna answer part of it. But somebody asked, "Are you aware of efforts within the Episcopal Church to address that statement you're making me feel bad by bringing people together to talk about this?" So you talk about what's going on nationally, and then we have several people from the Race Task Force that can answer this question in terms of inside Colorado. But I think it's a great final question.
Yes. Short answer is yes. Two things that come to mind. My wife is missioner for youth, young adult, and campus ministries for the Episcopal Church. She coordinates the Episcopal Youth Event, coordinates the campus chaplains, and they're doing all of these things. The Campus Chaplains Network is having conversations around race, racism, systemic racism. So yes, these are happening in a lot of networks kind of our churches. I think two ways in which I think I think one of the things, kind of like I mentioned with that colleague of mine, just kind of fixing the sign. Like, the more we do this, the more we do it, and the more it spreads, and the more it becomes part of kind of how we do what we do. When I was academic dean of the seminary, we were coming up with the goals and purposes of our Master Divinity program. And we said, we are making anti-racism, multiculturalism, and diversity one of the goals of our program, and every single course of this seminary has to address it. Biblical studies has to come from a multicultural perspective. that every single course has to address this question of anti-racism, multiculturalism, and diversity. We kind of said, if we think it's important, then we have to make ourselves mutually accountable to it. I think that's kind of, we keep thinking about if this is important to us, then how does it impact and affect the things we do and how we do what we do? And then how do we start to think about ways to just start to integrate that into how we do what we do?
So, all right, Bonnie Sarah Spencer, who's one of the members of the Race Justice Task Force, I can see her on the screen. Do you want to answer this for the state of Colorado? Because there is so much going on.
I can't. Can y'all hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I can't. The other part of my household is watching the debate. I definitely have the better deal here. But I can't totally speak for the whole diocese, but I think there's a lot going on within Episcopal churches where, white folks, I hope, they are getting together to kind of talk about, it's white folks' work to do, right? And so there's a group called My Work to Do that people have been participating in. That's not an Episcopal thing, but a good thing. And then there's lots of discussion groups. A lot of congregations are doing the Sacred Ground conversations, which is reading and talking and all over the state. And then different book discussions. There are at least 2 things, and especially now during COVID, that are virtual in the metro area that people could participate in. Soul to Soul is a Black womanist organization that centers Black lives, but talks about facing racism and works with white folk around that. Super difficult, challenging, wonderful, enlightening conversations where you at the end come up with your own racial justice plan. Also, Shorter AME Church in Denver has a program called Race Talk University. I've done both of those. They're outstanding. And then for folks in Colorado, the diocesan website, Becoming Beloved Community, has a list of all kinds of activities that are also going on. I think Linda Brown and Jesse Brown are also on the task force. I don't know, those are some things. I don't know, the Thurman conversations are another, which is a good thing as well. So I don't know.
Thanks, Bonnie Sarah. That's great.
Sure.
So I want to add one more. There's a fabulous series out of Duke University's documentary studies program called Seeing White. I think it's a 12-part podcast series. It is phenomenal. It's really good. It's one of the best things. Our church did that a few years ago, and it was a hit. And just a bunch of white people talking about race and society. It's really quite good. So I'd recommend that to folks too. Tom, I know you had other really tempting viewing options tonight. Thank you for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Stay tuned, folks. Our next Thurman conversation will be in 2 weeks on November the 5th. We have as our guest the religious studies scholar and podcaster Elise Morgenstein First. Elise writes and teaches about Islam, Judaism, and how those religions relate to Christianity. Her podcast, Keeping It 101, A Killjoy's Guide to Religion, keeps our producer up at night laughing and writing down book titles to read. Join us for what will be a real treat. Thank you to our producer, Michelle Auerbach, and to our series collaborators, the Race Task Force of the Episcopal Church in Colorado. Tom, where can folks find you?
Sandwich, Massachusetts. And I'm online at crustyolddean.blogspot.com.
We'll send that out with the playback.
There's some good stuff in there. I would not only should you read Tom's blog, but you should also go in and look at his bio and profile stuff. He's got some pretty interesting music things on there that I found fascinating. So again, Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. And thank you for all the work you're doing in Colorado on this.
As always, folks, if you like what you're hearing here, don't tell us, tell your friends. Stay safe, love your neighbor, and wear a mask. Good night, everyone.
Peace.
Peace.